We have a huge buffet of management-related virtual machine tasks in this nugget. We'll cover items such as how to hot add and remove memory from a running VM. We'll look at enhanced session mode, secure boot, direct device assignment, integration services. We'll even look at how to import and export VMs across Hyper-V hosts, and we'll learn how to upgrade a virtual machine to the latest version of Hyper-V. Let's fire up the virtual lab and get started. We're going to perform all of these management tasks on our admin NUG machine. We have our two Hyper-V hosts, HV1NUG and HV2NUG, that we'll be remotely managing here from this machine. Let's start in the GUI by firing up Hyper-V Manager. So let's give that start button a right click, head up to run, type in virtmgmt.msc, hit enter, and that should launch us right into the Hyper-V Manager here where we have a connection to both HV1NUG and HV2NUG. Let's start on HV1NUG, which is currently hosting two Windows VMs, CoreNUG and GUINUG. Both of these are currently in an off state. We're going to look first here at how to hot add and remove memory from a running VM. It's very simple to do, but there is one little thing we need to be aware of, and that is dynamic memory must be disabled in order to do this. Let's go into the settings here for CoreNUG, give that a right click, head over to settings, and let's go down to the memory area here. And notice that I do have dynamic memory disabled. Now, for the most part, dynamic memory will be your best bet for workloads running in your environment, so you can get better resource utilization out of your Hyper-V host. But there are scenarios where you would want to disable dynamic memory and just allocate big blocks of memory to specific machines. Hosting providers being the biggest use case there. They want to provide clients with exactly the amount of memory that they purchase, right? It makes it easier on billing and it gives the clients a more consistent experience. Well, now with dynamic memory, once they call up and say, hey, add another 20 gigs to that machine, we can do it on the fly. We don't need to take that machine down to give it another 20 gigs like we would with dynamic memory. And this is all controlled through this value right here. So we have dynamic memory disabled on both CoreNUG and on GUINUG. There we go. So we should be able to fire these machines up and then either add memory or take memory away while those machines are running. Let's do it. Let's go ahead and highlight both of these machines, right click, fire them both up, and we'll just give these a second to start here. So these are up and running. Let's go ahead and choose GUINUG here, and let's go down to memory. And we can see that we have 2 gigs allocated to this machine. Let's right click and go into the settings here, and let's see if we can modify that memory on the fly. Head down here to memory, and let's crank this up. Let's add another gig to it here, 3072. Hit OK. And what we should see down here now is we have 3 gigs of assigned memory. You can log into that machine and go into Task Manager and look at the memory, and that will also be reflected. So a great feature, very easy to use. We could easily take memory away just as we added it. Keep in mind though, this will only work with Windows 10 and Server 2016 guests. This is a brand new feature, so you won't be able to do this with your 2012 or prior VMs. And it also works with most Linux distributions out there, adding but not removing. It also works with Gen 1 and Gen 2 VMs. Next up, let's take a look at Enhanced Session Mode. Enhanced Session Mode is something that we enable at the host level. So if we choose Hyper-V settings over here on the right, it should pop up, and you will see by default, this is turned off. So we have the Enhanced Session Mode policy here, and we also have the Enhanced Session Mode default down here under the User section. Let's start up here at the Server section, and let's go ahead and turn this on. Now, what Enhanced Session Mode allows us to do, it gives us remote desktop-like capabilities here with our virtual machine connection window. And the really nice thing about it, kind of like PowerShell Direct, is we don't need a networking layer. It uses the VM bus to hit that machine. And Enhanced Session Mode, by the way, gives us the ability to do things like change resolution, map drives from our local machine into our VMs, map printers, audio, all the same capabilities you get with a remote desktop session. So once we enable it at the host level, that's it. We're done. Now we can use it whenever we connect to a VM. This setting down here will automatically use it if it's turned on at the server level. So it'll just save you an extra click. If this is unchecked, it will use a basic session. You'll need to click on the button on the toolbar to go into Enhanced Session Mode. We're going to go ahead and leave that checked, hit OK here, and then we will need to reboot our GUINUG machine here as well to pick up those changes. So I'm just going to right click here, we'll gracefully shut it down, hit shutdown, and now let's go ahead and turn it back on. So right click, start, and now once we connect, because we chose the default there of use if available, just give it a second here and it'll pop up our standard RDP or enhanced session dialog. There it is, which will allow us to change resolution. I'm going to pump this all the way down to 640. And then we have other options down here as well, which will open up local resources. And now we can map our local devices into this machine so we can easily access them from within our VM. I'm going to go ahead and leave the defaults there and hit connect. It's going to resize our window. And now we're in enhanced session mode. Look at that. We can fit it all on one screen beautifully. Also notice this button up here. This will revert us back to a basic session. It'll just toggle between basic and enhanced session. Now, one thing to note is that remote desktop services, just the service, needs to be running. You don't actually need to enable remote desktop on your servers for this to work. And just to show you what I mean here, if we head down to the Start button and head up to Server Manager and head over to Local Server, you'll notice that remote desktop is disabled. And that's fine. It can be disabled, but the remote desktop services service is running in the background and is by default, so you will need that functioning in order to use this feature. All right, so this all looks great. Let's go ahead and close out. Moving on, let's talk about Secure Boot. Now, once again, I'm going to shut down both of these VMs simultaneous here, so we'll highlight them both, hit shutdown, and confirm it. That will gracefully shut down both of those machines. And let's just go back into the settings. How about of GUI Nug once again? From here, let's head down to the security node. This is where we can control Secure Boot. Notice that it is enabled by default and pointed to the Windows template, which is the signed certificate here for Secure Boot. Now, this is actually a UEFI feature, UEFI. That's the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. It's the latest and greatest replacement to the traditional BIOS. BIOS didn't have any built-in security mechanisms. It would just simply scan your boot order, find the bootloader, and fire up Windows. So there's the potential there for malware, such as a rootkit, to replace your bootloader and cause all kinds of chaos on your system. Same with Linux. BIOS would find the grub bootloader and do the same thing. UEFI prevents that by checking the bootloader every time a machine fires up and ensuring that it's signed by Microsoft. If it's not, and some malicious bootloader took over the system, well, the machine just won't boot. So there's nothing more we need to do here because we are enabled and pointed at the right certificate. So both of our Windows machines are good to go. Our Linux machines, on the other hand, are not. Let's head over to HV2 NUG. Let's right-click on LNX NUG here. This is our CentOS machine, and go to Settings. When we installed CentOS, we actually disabled Secure Boot. What we could have did, though, is leave it enabled and just choose the right template, because the Windows template is the default. It will not boot if you just create a VM out of Linux here and leave the defaults because it has the wrong certificate assigned to it. But all we need to do is enable it and drop down the UEFI certificate, and now we're good to go, and we can secure boot our Linux VM. Now, one thing to note, though, is secure boot is unsupported on FreeBSD at the moment. And just to prove that this will indeed work here on our Linux NUG machine, let's go ahead and connect to it. We'll give that a right click, connect, and fire it up. You will not get past the boot screen if this didn't work. And it did work because it took us into our menu there. And now it's loading up successfully. So Secure Boot is enabled and working great on our Linux NUG machine. All right, moving on. Let's head back over to HV1 NUG and let's talk about integration services. Let's pick on GUI NUG here again by right-clicking and heading into the settings. You're going to notice we have integration services down here, and this is what allows our guest machines to better communicate with our host machine. It gives us some functionality that we can perform outside of those guests, such as operating system shutdown. This is what allows us to gracefully shut down our VMs here from our host machine. So if for whatever reason you didn't want that capability, then you could just turn it off here. Time synchronization will allow our guest VMs to synchronize with the host's clock. And this is something that you'll probably want to leave alone most of the time unless you're dealing with Active Directory domain controllers as VMs and you want to sync their time to something else. Then you would turn that off. Next up, we have data exchange, and this is what allows our VMs to report information back to our host machine. This is where a lot of the status comes from in memory down here that we see. Back in settings, we also have the heartbeat service. This will allow our VMs to periodically send heartbeats to our host, so the host knows if they're responsive or not. And you can actually see this in the summary tab when a VM is running as well. It'll actually have a health field there, and you'll know if they're okay or unresponsive. Next up, we have the backup service. With this on, we can take backups of our VMs from the host machine, and it'll back up everything from the virtual machine's configuration to the VHDs to even checkpoints. This does rely on the volume shadow copy service, so that will need to be running, but this means we can run backup software on our host to back up our VMs. Finally, the only one that is disabled by default is guest services. All this does is allow us to use a single PowerShell commandlet called copy VM file, which we can use to copy files easily from the host to our VMs. All right, let's keep moving here. The next thing we're going to look at is how to import and export VMs. And this is useful in a number of scenarios. Number one, migrating our machines to another host. And number two, just making a copy of a machine, either on the same host or copying it over to a different host. And it's incredibly simple to do. For example, let's say that we wanted to either migrate or make a copy of GUI NUG over on our HV2 NUG machine. all we need to do is right click and choose export. And by the way, this step is optional if you have access to your source files for GUI-NUG. So our VHD and the virtual machine settings, we can skip the export and just import right from those machines onto another machine. But we'll go through this whole process anyway here. When you export, all you're going to do is specify a location to where these files are going to get copied to. And let's go ahead and copy these here onto our local machine, HV1NUG, onto the local Hyper-V host, I should say. HV1NUG, $VMs, and I made an exports directory in there. We're going to go ahead and choose that and hit export. And that'll just take a second here. You can actually see the progress here in status. And that's done. Now let's take a peek at what that did. Let's head into the file system here. And let's just browse right through that hidden share over on our V volume on HV1NUG, into VMs, into exports, and there it is. It'll make a directory here. Inside of there, we'll have a directory for snapshots, hard disks, and VMs. Notice here, there's our hard disks, both our boot system, our boot volume there, as well as our data volume that we connected to it when we made that machine. And down here are the virtual machine settings files. So what we're going to do now, we could head over to HV2NUG and reference this directly on the import, but we would require to set up Kerberos delegation for that between these machines, because this is actually done in the security context of Hyper-V itself, not our security credentials. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just copy this onto the clipboard there. And now I'm going to browse over to HV2NUG, where we have that same exports directory, and I'm just going to paste that right into there. So that's done. Now we can head over to HV2NUG. We're going to right click right on HV2NUG and choose to import virtual machine. This will walk us through a really simple wizard here, and there's really only one big decision we need to make after we browse to that directory. So let's hit browse here. This will plant us right on HV2NUG's file system. We'll head into the V volume, VMs, exports, and there is that directory. So we can just choose that folder and hit next. Here is where we will choose the actual VM itself, hit next, and this is the big decision you need to make. Our first option here is to register the virtual machine in place. That's the key word there, because what this will do is take the export files that we're working with right here and use those as the source exactly where they are. Also, this is going to use the same existing virtual machine ID. In fact, if we choose next here, the next screen is finish. And I'm going to show you why that matters here, because if we go back, our next option, restore, is very similar to register, but rather than use our export files, it's going to make a copy of them either into the default location or give you an opportunity to specify a new location. If we hit next here, it's going to add another step into the wizard to ask us where we want to store the copied files. So think of register as it's going to use that export. Think of restore as it's going to copy that export to a new location. But both of these will use the same virtual machine ID. So you use either of these when you're migrating to another host. The third option here is to copy the VM, but create a brand new ID. So this will still allow us to take that export and copy it to a new location, but the key here is that it's going to have a brand new virtual machine ID. So this is the option you'll use if you want to create a copy of a VM on the same box, because we can't have two VMs with the same ID running on the same machine. So we're going to choose the second option here to restore. That way our export files are left alone and our virtual machine will get planted in the default location to where our other VMs on this host live. So I'm going to go ahead and choose next. Here we'll stick with the default since we already set up the defaults. The destination here is for your configuration files, checkpoint, and smart paging. We could override these. In fact, we have a paging directory out there, so why don't we do that? Let's browse and choose that paging directory. There we go. Perfect. Now we can hit next. And this is where our disks are going to go. We'll leave the default there, hit next, and now we're all done. We can hit finish, and we're going to have GUI-NUG now also on HV2NUG. And there it is. Now we can give that a right click and fire it up, only this time it's running on HV2NUG. Now the last couple of things we're going to talk about here, direct device assignment as well as upgrading our virtual machine configuration version, is PowerShell specific. So let's go ahead and right click on the PowerShell icon and launch in to the ISC. From here, let's hit that open button on the toolbar, which will plant us right into the Nugget Lab directory on the root of the C drive. And let's open up pscommands.ps1. And let's start by getting a session going on HV1NUG. So we'll PowerShell right on to our Hyper-V host. And just so you know, I added the PowerShell equivalent of everything else that we just did in the GUI. So here's how you can modify memory on the fly here. You can use the set VM memory command. Here's how you can turn enhanced session mode on at the host level. Here's how you can configure secure boot for your VMs. Set VM firmware is the commandlet there. Enable secure boot as the parameter. Turn that on or off and specify your template. You can also view your current settings here by running a get VM and piping that over to get VM firmware. This will show us what our current secure boot settings are for both of our machines. And check it out. We have Microsoft Windows, the security template, and Secure Boot is on for both of those. Direct device assignment is another one, and this is pretty cool stuff. This is a brand new feature as well here in Server 2016 that allows us to give direct access to PCIe hardware devices from our host to our VMs. And what this will do is allow us to bypass the virtualization stack, which will give our VMs incredible performance because they'll have direct access to PCI specific hardware. The big use case right now is giving our VMs their own GPUs. So we can hook a GPU or a stack of GPUs up to a host machine, disable them in the host, and then use these direct device assignment commandlets to assign them directly to VMs on that host. Now, unfortunately, there's nothing really in a lab environment we can do to demonstrate this, but I can show you the PowerShell commandlets you'll be using to make this possible. If we run a git command, search for anything that contains the word device inside of the Hyper-V module, here's how it works. Now, the biggest thing to remember here is that you will need to disable this in Device Manager on your host machine. So whatever card you want to pass through or whatever PCIe device you want to pass through to your VMs, first you'll disable it. Then you'll get a reference to the path, and then you can add it to a specific VM. All right, as we scroll down a little bit here, we also have integration services. Here's how you can get a list of all the integration services that in their current state on a specific VM. So let's see what we got here on GUI-NUG. There they are. And if we wanted to enable one, we can just run the enable VM integration service, pass in your VM name and the name of the service. So guest services is off by default. Let's go ahead and turn it on, and that would give us access to that one commandlet. Now, if we rerun the get, it is now on for GUI-NUG. Also, if you want to do any exporting and importing, a couple of simple commandlets for doing that. Export VM, specify the name of your VM and the path for those export files, and then import VM for importing. And the default is restore, but you have commandlets or parameters here for doing a register import or for doing just a simple copy. And then, of course, if you can also control if you want to create a new GUID here by generate new ID. So pretty straightforward stuff there. And finally, the last thing we're going to look at here is how to upgrade your VM version. So 8.0 is the VM configuration version for Server 2016, and you can see that inside of the GUI over here on the right-hand side. So remember, if you want to take advantage of all the Server 2016 features, especially if you're bringing VMs from older Hyper-V hosts, then you will need to run this on your VMs to up their configuration. If for whatever reason you don't need to take advantage of anything in 2016, then you can leave them on their older versions. But it's very simple. Update VM version will upgrade them and their configuration files to 8.0. And that completes our smorgasbord of virtual machine management tasks. In the CBC Nugget, we covered a big list of virtual machine settings, some of which were new here in Server 2016, and we learned how to configure and manage them. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.